let's move on to Havana Syndrome. This is it's the syndrome which simply just won't die. For those,
the fake syndrome
it has
won't
killed
die.
more people in frustration at its coverage than it actually has allegedly killed. And Havana Syndrome, just to return for those who have not heard of it, it has been now alleged for some 5-6 odd years from the Cuban embassy in Havana, where it gets its name, where allegedly U.S. workers, embassy workers, were being targeted with some new directed energy weapon and experiencing a bizarre array of symptoms. This was then accepted as fact, published by the media, ascribed then, even though it occurred supposedly in Havana, to the Russian government, and became a full-on Russiagate craze throughout the 2000s, to the extent that the United States Congress passed money to help them with their health bills, where the U.S. intelligence community at first was treating it as real. The media has an entire panic about whether U.S. diplomats are being attacked with this newfangled weapon. It was eventually killed and said that it was totally fake, and by the U.S. intelligence community itself. And yet, 60 Minutes has decided to resurrect Havana Syndrome and say, no, even though the people who have every incentive to lie and say that it is real, even though they even say that it's not real, they are actually orchestrating a cover-up. Here's what they had to say.
If it is Russia, investigative reporter Krystal believes he knows who's involved. In 2018, Grozev was the first to discover the existence of a top-secret Russian intelligence unit, which goes by a number, 29155.
These are people who are trained to be versatile assassins and sabotage operators. They're trained in counter-surveillance, they're trained in explosives, they're trained in using poison and technology equipment to actually inflict pain or damage to the targets.
And Grozev says he found one that may link 29155 to a directed energy weapon.
And when I saw it, I literally had tears in my eyes because it was spelling out what they had been doing.
It's a piece of accounting. An officer of 29155 received a bonus for work on, quote, potential capabilities of non-lethal acoustic weapons.
So he supposedly, this literally reads like a Tom Clancy novel, Krystal. Unit 29155 of the GRU. By the way, who is this man? He's a Bulgarian journalist who previously worked for Bellingcat, which has been funded by the CIA, and head of the investigations at, quote, The Insider, which is an online newspaper supposedly founded by a Russian journalist and obviously hostile to the Russian government. Now, I don't know very much about this man. What I do know is that if you just look, it's very basic in terms of the Maidan, the Bellingcat connections and all that, with all the incentive in the world to play up some grand conspiracy. And all of this just taking at the word of, frankly, a bunch of diplomats and other people who could be suffering from any kinds of health maladies, for whatever reason, hypochondriacs and others, who are just being totally believed with, frankly, no skepticism by the media here, and in parroting a crazy accusation, which is that somebody is firing a secret microwave energy weapon through the walls at your head for what purpose? To immobilize you. I just keep coming back to why, for what reason, what purpose would this entire thing exist?
Yeah, so this was really sold as, blockbuster story. It was a partnership between 60 Minutes, German newspaper Der Spiegel, and Insider, which, as Saagar was just saying, is this outlet of Russian dissidents. So clearly, they have a perspective, that's fine. But you have to take that perspective into account when you're considering the quote-unquote reporting here. And they even have to admit in the piece that the quote-unquote evidence that they're able to produce is circumstantial. Mm-hmm. So the big smoking gun is the piece that we just showed you, this translated, memo of accounting referring to some ambiguous directed energy acoustic weapon, right? That has no specifics. We have no tie-in to what's happening here. We don't even know if this is a real thing, right? So it's very speculative, okay?
Yeah.
There's another piece. There was an incident that unfolded in the country of Georgia, and they have some potential indications that maybe this one guy who may be affiliated with this unit could have been in the area when one of these attacks happened, and then they also have one of these attacks, I'll use the quotes, happen, and then they also have some sort of a brief intercepted communication in Russian where someone says, is the green light supposed to be flashing and should it stay on all night? Now, again, this is very speculative, okay? To connect these pieces and say, aha, that must be what's happening. The evidence is just not there to justify that conclusion. I'm trying to be as diplomatic as possible here, okay?
Okay, the green light thing.
That could be anything.
That's something for those of you who are Whoop gang, that's what I say when I plug in my Whoop charger, because it's green and it shines in the middle of the night.
I'm going to guess there's like a fair number of Russian speakers in the country of Georgia and Tbilisi at any given moment.
Yeah.
So, the idea you intercepted this call, they paint it as, again, like this kind of smoking gun when it really, really isn't. But to me, perhaps the most revealing part of the 60 Minutes segment on this, expose on this, came at the very end, where one of the primary people that they're relying on for this analysis, they mention in passing that now he's left the Pentagon and he wants to get government contracts to deal with Havana Syndrome sufferers. So he has a direct monetary incentive to, spin this story and paint this picture, et cetera. One of the other key individuals that they interview as part of this is a lawyer who's representing a bunch of Havana Syndrome, quote unquote, sufferers. So you also have, a monetary and personal incentive to paint this picture. So, when you put the pieces together of what they actually were able to produce here versus, what we know and what the government has even had to admit at this point, and I don't think that they were excited to admit this, by the way, because they seem very gung-ho about the whole Havana Syndrome situation, it doesn't really add up.
No, it's certainly. And there's also a hilarious part of the interview where they attempt to disguise a woman by just putting her in a wig and hoping that if she looks a little bit like Lady Gaga, nobody will be able to guess who she is. So if you're watching in particular, you're going to want to see this. Let's take a listen.
One of them is Carrie. We're disguising her and not using her last name because she's still an FBI agent working in counterintelligence. She says in 2021, she was home in Florida when she was hit by a crippling force.
And bam, inside my right ear, it was like a dentist drilling on steroids. That feeling when it gets too close to your eardrum, it's like that, times 10. It was like a high-pitched metallic drilling noise, and it knocked me forward at like a 45-degree angle this way.
As you can see, she's talking about some bizarre symptoms, but frankly, just from watching that, Krystal, look, I'm not going to look into who she is because she shouldn't want her identity revealed, but it's like, how is that possibly going to shield you from any public scrutiny? Just ridiculous. You're actually trying to protect somebody's actual, their identity. Let's also go and put this up there on the screen, as we mentioned. The intelligence community itself says that this is fake. They say the Havana Syndrome was not caused by an energy weapon or a foreign adversary, according to them. And the basic 60 Minutes theory is that all of this is being covered up to avoid some sort of war with Russia or some sort of accusation. Just think about this very clearly. Our government has every incentive in the world to whip up conspiracy theories about Russia to keep the American population against them so that we can continue to buy into their Ukraine funding hoax, which they are dramatically unpopular and underwater with. There's no reason that they would want to cover this up. If it was even 2% true, they would say it was true. Think about the other crap that they've pushed on us. The Russian bounty story in Afghanistan. I mean, I can go on forever. But for some reason, this one in particular, that one, they're covering up. We're not even talking about deaths, we're talking about alleged attacks. Another very clear sign about who are the people who are very, rejoicing around this. Here you have John Bolton saying that it's real and that we need to get very serious about it. Let's take a listen.
When I was National Security Advisor, I was briefed on this. I was very concerned about it. I did then and do now think that there's very likely some hostile adversary behavior here, whether it's Russia, China, maybe somebody else, more than likely Russia. I don't think the government, frankly, when I was there, took it seriously enough. I don't think they've taken it seriously enough since then. I commend CBS for going after it. I think you should continue to go after it too, because the danger that the Russians or any adversary could actually perfect this kind of weapon, the damage it could do to our troops, to high-level government officials in a time of crisis, is very, very concerning. And I just think people swept it aside too quickly. Some of the people who were affected actually were National Security Council staff when I was there. And the idea that these people had some kind of psychosomatic experience was not credible to me. But we know that the Russians have used directed energy efforts against our embassy in Moscow in years past. The speculation this time on 60 Minutes was it was acoustical devices. I think directed energy is probably more likely.
So there you go, Krystal. For directed energy, this is the likely reason. It's definitely the Russians. Anytime I see something like this, you would just have to be deeply skeptical. And I think the broader point to all of this, why do we even care, is because certain psyops that the media deems credible of, airing here, basically with a very little shreds of evidence. Again, on 60 Minutes, our premier television investigative review program, for some reason, as long as it's Russia, then we can roll it out there. We can even allege that the U.S. government, which has cooked up the most insane Russian conspiracies of the last 7 years, that they itself are in on some grand Russian conspiracy.
Yeah.
It doesn't pass the smell test.
Joe Biden called Vladimir Putin a war criminal.
I know.
And his administration's official position is that they're committing genocide in Ukraine.
Thank you.
But he's going to be afraid to say that they're using some sort of directed energy or acoustic weapon or whatever against our diplomats. It just doesn't really make sense. And as I said, I genuinely listen to this thing with an open mind, okay? I am perfectly willing to be wrong. And as someone who, I trust and respect, took it seriously and was like, really give it a genuine listen. But the scraps of quote unquote evidence that they offered just do not justify this really extraordinary conclusion. And it is an extraordinary conclusion. I mean, as you said, it sounds like something out of a spy novel.
Yes.
So if you're going to assert something that is really extraordinary and also potentially, leads to escalation and provocation and all of these sorts of things, you better have some real stuff to back it up. And they definitely did not in this instance. And also they relied on the credibility of a number of people who have direct financial interests or personal interests in Havana Syndrome being real and being, from a foreign adversary. National Institutes of Health, in addition to that intel assessment that said, we really don't think that this came from a foreign adversary, there were new studies that were just conducted by National Institutes of Health, NIH, which failed to find any evidence of brain injury in scans or blood markers of the diplomats and spies who said they suffered symptoms of Havana Syndrome. Now, this did contrast with, there was a previous earlier study done by University of Pennsylvania that did claim to find some differences in the brain scans. What NIH says is that they were able to do a more comprehensive study, both in terms of the brain scans that they had, but also in terms of the control group, more closely matched the demographic characteristics of the people who were the sufferers, so they felt more strongly about their conclusions. So, the very latest studies from the NIH, for what it's worth, say we don't actually even see signs of injury in these individuals. I don't want to say that they didn't suffer something real, because even if it is stress-induced psychosomatic, that can still be experienced as a very real and potentially debilitating event. So this is not to dismiss them or say they're lying and they didn't really suffer anything whatsoever, but to put all these instances together and to allege one culprit and to craft this narrative, which really, beggars belief, is just, it's just way too many bridges too far, multiple bridges too far.
You are a lot more charitable than I am. Let's just say that. And I guess, look, if you have suffered from Havana Syndrome and you can prove it, you're welcome on the show anytime. We'll talk to you for sure.
Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.